Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Eco Missing Middle, Streetscape Community High Performance. My name is Shalika Sivathasan, and I am the Administrative Assistant in the Continuing Education Department at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and who are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. Kindly note the chat function has also been deactivated. However, we do highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit any questions that you have for our speakers there. Questions will be addressed during the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your OAA transcript. Please just allow a few days for the processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that the presenters do not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. Now, I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today's session, Cheryl Atkinson and Rolf Paloheimo. So Cheryl is an associate chair and professor in architecture at TMU and principal of Atkinson Architect in Toronto. Her teaching, research, and design have focused on missing middle housing development and design strategies, with emphasis on its capacity to shape more beautiful, social, and environmentally sustainable housing and cities. This work includes a focus on reclaiming and adaptive reuse of underutilized land and buildings, and strategies to improve performance and cost through prefabrication and circularity. Her 18 years as a design lead at Teeple Architects contributed to many buildings, winning OAA and Governor General's awards, including libraries, community centers, childcare, and academic buildings, and she has practiced independently since joining TMU. And Rolf Paloheimo has an extensive career in sustainable housing research, development, and construction and system innovations. Together with architect Martin Liefheber, in 1996, they produced the Toronto Healthy House, an urban off-grid, no municipal water, sewage, or power, demonstration home for CMHC, where Paloheimo lived with his family for 20 years. He has developed integrated PV and renewable energy projects and has patents for water reclamation technology. He has been an advisor to the Federal Green Municipal Funds and Sustainable Development Technology Canada, and he is currently developing missing middle housing in Toronto. So please join me in welcoming Cheryl Atkinson and Rolf Paloheimo. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shalika. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to start just with a few images of some of the work that we've done individually in this area, which also explains partly how we got together and the project initiated. I did a project a few years ago on a sabbatical with students and the Endeavour Center in Peterborough with Chris Magwood, which was this is where it landed at the end. It's a freestanding house, but it was a prototype unit for missing middle housing that we designed and built with the assistance of students, both his construction students and our design students, to test a prefab building, and exhibited it in Toronto and moved it to several different locations until it was bought, and now lives here in Collingwood with a friend of mine who bought it. So that's how it would have sat on a main street as the upper unit of a stacked pair of townhouses over commercial. This is Chris Magwood's team building it in a tent in a field in Peterborough using all solar electricity and PV. There it is being hoisted into its final situation, and an image of the integrated PV rooftop flex panels that we use to make a kind of innocuous rooftop solar collection. So it was very ambitious in terms of its not only getting to net zero energy, but net zero carbon. So that's the project when it was first put together on site in Peterborough.
Okay. And this is how I got started in sustainable development and interested in urban infill. This was a project I did with CMHC. I picked it up after Martin Lefebvre had won a prize for it, and CMHC invested quite a bit of time in it. And we ended up building 2 houses. They were off-grid for water and sewer, and we're the first grid-connected solar homes in Canada, and they're still standing today. But there were 2 of them. I eventually sold one, and I raised my 2 girls in the other one, and they still stand today in Riverdale. Sorry, and in the middle teens, I ended up wanting to do development and ended up working with Cheryl on the first project.
Which brings us to where we are today.
Yeah.
So this presentation is on Gerrard Street East, a project that was just completed early last spring and rented out over the spring, summer, now completely rented. We're going to be talking about the background of the project, the process, and details and zoning. And these are our learning objectives listed below. So development processes, design strategies, some construction strategies, and what worked and what didn't. These are the listed learning objectives for the OAA. So to recognize the importance of site selection, to recognize a dynamic current landscape of approval processes, changing all the time, in fact, through our whole project. To recognize some strategies to design for health, livability, and community within limited space, and to recognize design strategies to maintain these values within the challenges of tight development budgets. So,
yeah, for me, I was interested. Both of my girls moved out of town looking for cheaper housing, essentially, or a cheaper way to live, and I got interested in urban infill and affordability.
Yeah, we also, and for me, I was interested in the project because it was an opportunity. I don't do a lot of these kinds of projects. In fact, this was the first, and we're working on our second. But it was about making a unique project with a developer who had similar values about sustainability. It's rare when somebody comes to you and says they want to do a net zero carbon building and a net and rental, and are looking for sites in the inner city. So for me, it was quite interesting because it was about celebrating the benefits, not just of sustainable architecture, but lively urban environments. So why is it important? I think a lot of people know all of this by now. There's been a lot of discussion in the recent past and a lot of changing bylaws. But on the topic of losing urban families, here's some data that says that in the 5 years between 2016 and 2021, Toronto lost 16,600 children under 14 which is really damaging to cities. So if you love cities, this is a problem. And we worry about development charges with new construction, but we have all this existing infrastructure here in the city, and we should be using it. So we'll get into this further through the presentation, but a lot of the advantages of this kind of housing is it's stick-built, it's less expensive to build, buy, and rent. It creates construction jobs for a whole other group of builders, which is important, particularly in the climate we're in right now, where condo construction has crashed. Essential workers for the city are retained: teachers, doctors, people who, daycare workers, people who need to live in the city. And we use existing infrastructure. Just a couple of slides talking about density that I show some of my students. We did a project in downtown Toronto this year around Pembroke Street, which this is a view of, and talking about what is the density of Toronto, which is incredibly low per hectare compared to places like European cities that we think of as, mid-rise cities, 5 to 6 stories above a level of retail. And we're all attracted to those cities and want to visit them. This is another image that I think people are pretty familiar with, which kind of describes why it's important because of the scale of the issue. So we may think that replacing individual houses with infill is a drop in the bucket, but because it's such a huge area that if we change the bylaws, there's such a huge portion of the GTA is zoned single-family residential. This can have a huge impact just through sheer volume. Again, I'm just going to do a little bit about the emergence of this idea that intensity is a good idea and infill is a good idea. The problem was really initiated in the early part of the century when walk-up apartments were outlawed in Toronto from single-family residential neighborhoods. They used to be, you see them all over the city now. They're in Forest Hill, they're in the beaches, they're in the annex. Very important sources of housing for young people and single people and elderly people. It took another 60 years for somebody to challenge that bylaw in the mid-70s. When Barton Myers and Jack Diamond made this proposal and built it for infill housing on Sherbourne Street, using the comparison of the same density from a tower on the site turned on its side. It was another 20 years after that project for laneway houses to really start to take hold. And people like Bridget Shim and Jeff Stinson built laneway houses in back lanes, and it was kind of the start of this impetus to develop infill in the city. Maybe Rolf can put the cat outside. So since then, we've had, there's been a flurry of changes to bylaws and interest and action from the city and from the province and from the federal government to make infill housing a reality. And ending kind of most recently with this very important CMHC booklet with templates of infill houses that are designed for districts right across Canada. So there's an image of one by Levitt Goodman Architects, who were lead coordinators and designers in this project of an infill template for a sixplex. So just an image from the city's website promoting infill and promoting the rationale for it. And there's a close-up of the fourplex that Levitt Goodman Architects designed that was just issued last fall. And again, another recent publication by Gabriel Fain and Studio Varo through the Neptis Foundation after an initial study on missing middle, advocating for courtyard housing or renovating blocks in Toronto to create courtyard housing. So that brings us to our project and what were our objectives and processes. So again, affordable rental for families priced out of the city, proximity, a walkable context, gentle density, livability, and family scaled units, handsome, durable, and timeless architecture, and passive house equivalency. We recognized it was pretty hard to achieve full certified passive house in this kind of a project, but we tried to keep it low carbon and holistically sustainable urbanistically. So we'll talk about this, the developer's selection of the site.
Okay, yeah. So we took, I think, close to a year to find a site. So we eventually found this site on Girard, and which was 50 feet wide, and the zoning was relatively permissive. Happens to be on a streetcar track. There's a park really close by. There's a lane behind it. There's down the street, there's a couple of walk-up apartments, and across the street there were rooming houses. Well, there still are, but looks like they'll be developed into some other low-rise now. And so it seemed like a good starting point. And we didn't know at the time exactly what we were going to do, but we purchased it and then started planning. So this is just listing some of the benefits of that neighborhood. So the streetcar stop, there's stores nearby, there's a library nearby, there's a community centers, a swimming pool, the subway. You can walk to the subway if you don't want to take the streetcar. There's GO Transit. It's actually a pretty connected site. Here's just an overview map with sort of highlights. You can see that
the actual site's the upper right-hand corner. Behind the tree is the house that was replaced by this project.
Right, yeah.
And the main street is the lowest image. So pretty vibrant main street and the GO station.
There's some more
images of the streetscape.
Yeah, exactly.
And the site and a close-up view of the main street. Okay, so we'll get into some of the approvals processes a little bit later on, but one of the things we had to do was actually abide by all of the zoning bylaws to create a fourplex at the time, which meant limited scale of projections and bay windows and dormers and mandated mansards. This was an early perspective view showing how it fit into the neighborhood to promote it with the neighborhood, and the final view showing how it actually does work pretty well, and using detail and smaller scale elements like the balconies to tie it into the scale of the rest of the project. One thing that's, I think, done very well with this project is actually having visible front doors to the development. Many proposals for fourplexes and sixplexes have the entrances along the side, so you might have one door at the front, sometimes none. So even though it was difficult to try and keep the stairs, limit the internal stairs from impinging too much on the space inside the units, it was important to do that, we felt, to have this identity and front door. That's an image of the mailbox that I designed for the the front door as well. So not only do we have front doors for the front, but we have them into the garden units at the front of the addressing Gerrard Street, but the laneway houses on the back each have entrances, and the laneway houses also have a front door to their neighbors across the courtyard at the fourplex. So lots of through daylight, etc. On the topic of community, it was this is a cross section of the two buildings opposite one another, 8 meters apart, abiding by all the setbacks with the legislated mansards. So it was important to have not just community within the neighborhood, but within the development itself. So having these different open spaces, front yard, courtyard, and a little bit of land on the lane creates open space for the tenants. So there's a close-up view showing the balcony. So we have quite generous balconies on the back of the floorplexes at all levels, and a lower level courtyard for the garden suite. And on the left is a courtyard drawing we did that was imagining how people might interact, and thinking about not necessarily trying to divide property up or put dividing lines between even one property and the next, but to join it as one collective whole, and provide open space for kids to play with one another and run around, and be able to join 2 picnic tables together and have a meal together, that kind of a thing. And the photograph on the right is one Rolf took just recently. He has his office in one of the units and stayed there for the first year, is only about to move out now, but to just make sure everything worked, garbage was able to be taken out properly and all those things. So a real, not a staged image, a real image of how people live in the place, as are these images on the laneway showing kids' ball hockey nets and how people set up their own furniture once they moved in. So density, we have 10 units where there used to be a single family house. So that is 6.6 times as dense as the original 4-person house was. So that much denser in units, that much denser in people, and 5.5 times as dense in units. And compared to the average density of Toronto in units per hectare, you can see it's significantly denser. It's not Paris, but it makes a huge impact relative to the very low density of Toronto. So there's some comparators. An average Canadian unit, 3-bedroom unit, or this is actually overall, the average Canadian housing unit is about 167 square meters. Our average 3-bedroom unit is about 63% of that. And hopefully we can show that we are creating livable space within that kind of density. So some more data on density. So here's an image of the ground floor plan, level 1 plan. So half a level above grade. It's one of the tighter units. You can see each unit has its own private stair, which means there's no common space in the building. And everybody's got control over that entry door. So we've got fairly generous, this being one of the smallest units, it's still got a fairly generous sized kitchen, and bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, one of them en suite, with a closet as part of that en suite. So fairly generous. The laneway house, much larger at 1,300 square feet, over 2 stories, has a very large closet at the entry off the lane with room for strollers, large seating area, full dining space, and a very large kitchen with washer dryer. Again, an ensuite bathroom above, and 3 generous sized bedrooms. Here's some images of that unit, unfurnished. So you see the scale of the kitchen and the windows to the laneway at the back. There it is, furnished with some of Rolf's stuff when he was using that as his office as he was renting out the rest of the apartments. So lots of seating area possible. These are staged images of some of the fourplex units. This is the 3rd floor. You can see the mansard roof and the access to the balcony there, and the U-shaped kitchen.
But this is the same unit with my furniture in it.
Right. So and wonderful views from up there into the trees, the existing urban forest, daylight coming in from the side and from the balcony both. There's another staged image of the lower level garden suite at the fourplex. Again, it's one of the, well, it's actually a pretty generous unit because it doesn't have the stairs taken out of it.
That's right. There's a surprising amount of space in this unit.
And this is the kind of composite staged and Rolf's furniture at the 2nd floor fourplex.
Yeah.
There's a bedroom, one of the master bedrooms with the ensuite bathroom. Again, a 4th floor bedroom, and you see the mansard and a pair of French doors out to the balcony facing the street. Okay, and so now we were going to talk about the development process and some of the challenges of that.
All right.
So
yeah.
I'm turning it over to Rolf.
Okay. Yeah. So we determined together we did our best to, as Cheryl said, match the zoning bylaw. So when we went into the city, we worked out a design that had no zoning variances whatsoever. However, we did have to go to committee of adjustment to provide a severance, and we're denied. We'll get to that in a minute. Our first try, we thought a good idea would be to divide it into three stacked townhouses, and we worked on that for a while, and I remember having a real trouble trying to figure out how we could make 3 bedrooms in this design. Anyway, we eventually applied to the city and for a zoning certificate, received one, but then learned we needed to go to site plan control, which would have taken a year and involved a pretty expensive application. I think it was something close to $100,000, and we would have needed significant number of consultants to be hired, which would have been another significant number. And so we decided to maybe scrap that and do the next thing, which was this plan. So developing this, we decided to only sever it into 2 units, and it seemed sensible at the time, and I still believe it is and was sensible. The 2 new lots were going to be bigger than the neighbor to the west and slightly smaller than the neighbor to the east, so appropriate. And then again, we did the architectural design matched the zoning bylaw perfectly. There were no variances. One of the struggles we had, there were a couple of struggles in terms of the site. One of the biggest one was soft landscaping. So you're required, when you have a laneway house, to have 85% soft landscaping. So that means you can, it's a challenge to do that, because stepping stones take away from it. The required bicycle parking takes away from it.
Balconies take away from it.
Balconies take away from it. Some of these things have changed, and I think we want to highlight this was pretty difficult. And we actually had to make smaller balconies as to meet that. And similarly, in the front, we had a challenge, because we wanted these retaining walls and going down to the garden suites, and so we could have decent windows down there and make them nice. And so all of these things took away from the soft landscaping. However, and so we ended up doing developing a little system which we use with taking gabions and then sloping the earth so that there's a kind of the gabion only does part of the height, less than 600 millimeters. And then we can garden over the top of it with a slope. And that way we don't have to have barricades or railings and so on and so forth. And it feels like part of the landscape. And it turned out to be pretty successful. We're happy with it.
Yeah,
there it is in real life, before any of the planting took root, but just right after construction, I guess
Right. Yeah, it was really important not to have a railing on the edge of a courtyard at the front of the house. Right. So this was a nice solution.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that changed between the time we initially applied was the rear yard setbacks. I should also note that at one point the city required, as a condition of the severance, that they be gifted, I think it was 220 millimeters yeah, to widen the lane. So, which was a surprise, but I mean, we managed to accommodate it. And then, but we discovered that the setback changed in the intervening time, so that we were able to stagger them. So the western lane house is a half a meter closer to the lane than the eastern one. Now, the eastern one had to be where it was because we also had a tree permit, and trees are an existential threat to lane houses. I just wanted to kind of underline that. I mean, it's a beautiful tree, and we didn't want to get rid of it. But what we ended up having to do, I mean, I'm not sorry we did it, but we had to think of something. And what we decided to do was to put the whole thing on helical piers. And you can see on the left, this is the contractor. He was almost finished putting them in just then. And so here's the picture on the left is not from our site, but it's a better picture than we have of them being put in, so you understand how they work. And so what we did is we put basically the lane houses are kind of floating on top of these helical piers, and then they're all wood construction. We used preserved wood foundation materials for the outsides, so that so they could survive the any termites or mold or what have you. Which most of that we had to import from Western Canada, because although it's in the code, it's not really used here in Ontario. But they feel they're integrated. They look like they're a conventional foundation, but they're actually floating. Mm-hmm. And the tree has survived.
Right.
So.
And it ended up reducing concrete again. We'd originally wanted to use preserved wood foundations on the whole project.
Yeah. So another challenge we had was hydro. So and we for most of the project up until drywall, we did not know what our service was going to look like. And because Toronto Hydro had was very slow in responding to us. And it turned out the reason was they were renovating the high voltage lines on Gerrard Street. So they just wouldn't talk to us. And as a result, we were unable to get temporary power. So we had a jury rig, I got some lithium batteries and an inverter, and we had a little, kind of like a cottage system running in the background, and then would charge it for, I paid the neighbor to let us plug it in at night. And then we ran some generators from time to time when that wasn't enough. But it was a headache. And so in the end, we did get service, and Toronto Hydro now has a missing middle standard. And I wanted to point out that for this class of project, they want to give you an underground service, single phase, which is more ideal in my opinion. And they, I think it's up to 800 amps. They will use a pole mounted transformer and then go underground, at the pole, and, but you want to get them involved as soon as you can, because you want to put it on your plans. You got to place it on the building.
And you don't want one of those big pad mounted transformers in your small front yard.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So then just to highlight, so once we got this built, there are other builders that say, oh, that's a good idea. Semi-detached fourplexes, we never thought of that. And there were people trying to replicate it. And wouldn't you know it, the city decided to make it, they decided, no, these aren't fourplexes. Those, when you put them together like that, that's an apartment building. So there was a period, I think it was about 8 months or something like that. And this is taken from, I think it was a Toronto Star article.
There were several articles in different papers about it.
So there, and so along the way, they've changed from semi-detached fourplexes to apartment building, and now it's called an attached houseplex.
Right.
So just to highlight the change.
And that it's a constantly changing landscape of rules, particularly recently. So yeah, upon opening this project, it suddenly was something that went from being championed as a viable alternative to being impossible to do, because they called it an apartment building. Yeah,
and in fact, this morning there's a headline that gives me pause in CBC. I just saw it just before this. Where people that want to do McMansions are actually proposing multiplexes that they're going to now turn back build as a multiplex, because the zoning bylaws are more permissive, and then turn it into a McMansion after.
So one of the huge things, of course, on any project is cost control. And what was nice about working with Rolf and his team was that they were open to using not only making it very sustainable, but also using nice materials. And we were looking at buying these Italian terracotta shingles to cover the house in, and or the housing in, and had to pivot when they became unaffordable.
Well, again, what happened during construction is the interest rates went up post-COVID, because most of our design period was COVID, and then the interest rates went to zero, and you could do anything almost. But when they went up, we had to face reality.
So we went to EFIS, and this will so Rolf's going to talk a little bit about development costs.
Yeah, I thought it would be useful to show these. This is sort of the broad scope of what it cost to do this project. So, and broken out into percentages. So the land was 30%. So it was like, by the time you added closing costs and this and that, it was a little more than 1.7 million. The construction, actually, I think we're using all one price per square foot. So it was 176 for land and $278 for construction was the constraint. Now, I just want to highlight there's a few other things. Finance, and we had bank financing, so it was relatively cheap, but we still have to have a quantity surveyor. Legals are surprisingly expensive, and we have to pay the bank's legals too, so we don't even get to choose the lawyer. And then so you have to watch out for that. In the other soft costs, the design, which includes the permits and the appeals, and again, we're paying for lawyers and planners and of course architects because we want it to be beautiful. And then there's construction management, which is so that's around 6%. Construction management around 4%. And we did end up having to pay some development charges. Servicing was small in comparison, and developer administration, that's a variable amount. It depends. If you're doing well in the budget, CMHC will allow you up to 5%, which is basically a fee, which you're basically reducing your equity. Okay.
One of the upshots of this was a big advantage, just as we were about to go under construction, was the federal government coming in and absolving us of HST costs and changes to the bylaws to eliminate development charges on fourplexes. So a lot of the development charges were reduced.
So, and here again, so that you can just appreciate, this is the whole thing has got to be paid for by the rent eventually. So in our case, we were around $3.40 a square foot. And you can see the soft costs are roughly 20% of that. And then the mortgage and return on equity make up the balance.
So, other things that were important to cost were windows and doors, and trying to get good quality windows that looked good, had nice profiles, but were, passive house. So we found these windows, Canadian windows. We didn't go with triple glazing because we determined both it was too expensive, but also in Ontario, in our part of Ontario anyway, the third layer isn't really worth the time it takes to pay off the extra embodied carbon and making that layer of glass. So we were reasonably happy with the windows, although Rolf finds that
there's some of them I have to do a little differently, but that's so.
Another way we saved money was, on the whole job, I think, was there's an economy of scale of doing 10 units versus a single family house, obviously. And working with a construction manager, they gave us access to some trades that normally we wouldn't have access to. And those included kitchen manufacturers who did quite good quality kitchens at a reasonable cost, as long as we kept the design consistent through all the different units. So Aya kitchens were our kitchens. Buying off the shelf, rather than relying on them for doing other cabinetry like vanities, they were still more expensive than buying some of the off the shelf items you can get from Toronto Vanity that include counters.
I just want to say Cheryl is a very good shopper.
Price savvy. Yeah, the mirrors and whatnot came from different places. I think the mirrors were IKEA, Other sort of hacks we used were I wanted to have welded steel railings, which were not affordable, but our trades suggested that we could take these standard little 1/2 by 1/2 inch steel pickets, and they'd give us a oak dowel railing. So we did that. We used IKEA for the cabinetry that wouldn't fit within mansard roofs. We avoided having ugly Canada Post group mailing boxes sitting on a pedestal right in the middle of the front yard for 10 units. This one's not even 10 units. So I designed this mailbox, and we had it fabricated by Rolf's son's friend. And we paid off Rolf paid off the local mailman with a cake, I believe, from the local bakery, which meant that the kind of mandate from Canada Post seemed to go away. So that was a nice benefit. Managing mansards, the 45-degree mansard, which is now gone as a bylaw constraint from laneway houses. It's been recently taken away, but managing to make some space under those sloped roofs, adding things like skylights gave us extra headroom, and an IKEA mirror gave you some a place to, see yourself above a vanity, but also provided a bit of privacy. I think you've since with
we added some blinds in addition if you wanted to pull even more.
So another critical issue on the project was balancing daylight and passive house, and having this nice wide site at 50 feet meant that we could have quite a few windows on the side walls by setting back 1.2 meters. So that has a huge impact on the quality of the units. Every unit's got 3 orientations for lots of daylight. They face north-south, and so they get east and west light on the side, depending on which side they're located on. So there's an early photo. I guess these were early rental.
Yeah, this is
photos.
Just before we rented.
Yeah, wide angle, but you can see the amount of light falling on the floor. It's quite good. Putting windows at the ends of hallways is also brightens up the units and provides view. Here it's blasted out by the location of the light, but it was a strategy in every unit. There you can see the one of the units, the top unit, facing south towards the courtyard with the side, just it's not a huge window on the side, but it has a really nice impact for providing view and a sense of openness and space. There it is again. Again, you can see this is real furniture and that same unit. So comfortable and generous, given the relative scale to the standard Toronto housing unit. There again, window at the end of the hall and a side window to a little den off an open railing. The balconies on the back also were an opportunity to bring in daylight. Initially, we'd proposed them to be nail laminated timber, but we were restricted from doing that because of fire code reasons. It would have made us have to reduce the adjacent. Instead of having one continuous balcony across the back, we would have had to split them into 2 and lost quite a bit of length in the balcony. So this was a nice solution, not great for high heels, but we've got little wood mats from IKEA that we added. Here's a view of the stairs, the entry stairs, again with side light into them. So even though it's a kind of longish stair to get to the top unit, which this is showing, it's a nice experience going up and down. You can see, the house owner or the tenant coming downstairs to greet you, and use color to brighten it up. Okay, now we'll talk about some of the details and performance.
Right, yeah. So what we wanted to minimize concrete if we could. We ended up, and as Cheryl said earlier, we wanted to do preserved wood foundations, but didn't prove practical. We ended up sticking with thick built. We did look seriously at doing panel building. We wanted to use blown cellulose where we could, and we did. I'm pretty happy with it, although and you can see the bales of stuff in the foreground. And the project is all electric, so you know, stoves and so on, and we used heat pumps and ERVs. Another thing that was important in the development was no common hallway. So there's no landlord electrical service. So there's no requirement to keep some inside area clean, or it's all kind of within tenant space and dealt with that way. So one of the strategies we used is, so the HVAC equipment, the ceilings are tall enough that we could afford to drop ceilings in the bathrooms and, you know, over kitchen cabinets and in some closets and so on. So we managed to keep all of our, or virtually all of our ventilation in those drop ceiling areas. And what it meant is that then the fire barrier could be built first, and the HVAC came in afterwards. All they had to do was provide anything that was buried in the walls, like the outside vents and the you know, refrigerant lines and stuff had to be done before drywall. After they came in after drywall, and then the drywall contractor did the drop ceilings and bulkheads, as the case may be, apart from the rough framing trade.
And it meant no furnace room by putting all that stuff in the ceiling, which saves space too.
Right, and so then in terms of the overall construction, we followed passive house basic principles. So the outside envelope is a you know, air permeable water type vapor, and there's always
Vapor permeable. Yeah.
A vapor permeable but watertight. But there's always insulation on the outside of it, and then the inside, what we used to call vapor barrier, is a more intelligent, and so that way we could use an unvented roof design, and the result is that the building's quite tight. Now, having operated for a year, I can say that we overdid it. We have ventless dryers, and so there were 3 different units that actually had a little too much humidity during the winter. So I think next time we will not do that. So it depended on how much laundry they were doing, essentially. Here's a close-up of one of the walls. The other thing I think I wanted to talk about, and this is really more about the changing regulatory, was our non-combustible wall, which we needed to be on the side walls. And so it's a steel stud, which we buried on the outside in IFAS, and on the inside, there was a whole other wood framed system, and then the whole thing was insulated with blown-in cellulose. But the thing that changed was the city was approving platform framing in this instance with using wood platforms. We did not make the mistake of doing that. What we used was a balloon framing or semi-balloon framed system, because we still needed fire stops at every floor, but which I think is now the standard. But I've heard from other builders that they complained. There were people that had to rebuild some of their structure because of the changing city interpretation. The OBC has stayed the same. But so, okay, here's another detail showing the corners and how, and essentially you can sort of see how we did the balloon framing and window details from this. Another thing that we found that I think might be useful for others is that we used a system from, I think it was US gypsum, but all the majors do it for party walls. We needed to have a non-combustible party wall, and they do it with liner board, and they have a U-channel system that you could, and so the benefit on site was that the rough carpenters can put this up. We don't have to wait for masons or concrete pours, and it also takes a lot less space, and we can put outlets and switches and so on in the party wall, and it's quite soundproof and generally a pretty good idea, I think.
Okay. So that's kind of winding up the presentation before we do a couple polls, but just some kind of summary advice about doing these kinds of projects. So policy around funding, zoning, and regulations changes very frequently, as we found. And as I discussed earlier, it took years, decades for there to be any change. And now it's so fast that you can't find a contemporary zoning bylaw that you can count on in any way for the current bylaws. Use experienced consultants, planners, architects, code consultants. The planner, particularly who is helpful on this, Sean Galbraith, is available to a lot of people doing these projects, and he seems the most up to date on what all the latest information is on changing bylaws. I mean, they're getting better. They're not getting worse.
Well, they promised they're going to get better, but
thirdly, always try and maintain a holistic and tiered hierarchy of goals. So be clear what your priorities are, and think in a really big picture way about what you're doing, and maybe don't worry about it if you have a bit of concrete or you don't have the best windows.
Compromise,
right. Be open to alternative ideas, materials, and technologies. So, these you started. Rolf had a lot of ideas about.
We had stars in our eyes.
Yeah.
Right.
But he came up with Glavol, an insulated drainage layer that we might use under the preserved wood foundations, which was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and you can get in some quantity, but it's hard to get in small enough quantities for this project.
Mm-hmm. So be research, keep your eyes open, and make decisions from a holistic perspective. Okay, so I guess we are ready to go to the OAA wants us to have some polls. So
there we
yeah, so I can read them out. What statements are correct about low rise missing middle? A, it's cheaper to build than high rise per square foot. B, it's more sustainable than a single family house. C, it has higher embodied carbon than building mid-rises on Toronto avenues. D, it's more expensive to develop than a mid-rise building as it has no economy of scale. So those are your choices, A and B, A and C, B and D, or none of the above. So Shalika's going to let us know how long to give you for these.
Cat wants back in.
Too bad.
Okay.
Okay. So
A and B is.
Yeah, A and B are
that's correct.
Largest number of 68% of you said A and B, which is the correct answer.
Right, from our perspective, yeah.
Right. You've been listening.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's kind of self-evident, that answer. And we all know how expensive it is to build high rises, which is why they cost so much. And even though there's a huge economy of scale to those, they're still a lot more expensive to build. And the development charges are so much more than doing something small.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess we could go to the next poll.
That's
Yeah. So, what did you learn from this session? A, how to develop this kind of housing. B, how to navigate emerging housing policy. C, how to make a lot of money. D, how to make an urban impact. And I guess I should have had choices for you on this one, but you just get to pick one, I guess. Maybe you can pick more than one in your answers. And following this, we're open to Q&A, so we'll have a question and answer session. Okay, so 50, how to develop this kind of housing.
good.
Rolf, you did a good job.
Oh, thank you.
59% voted on that.
Please.
Yeah. How to navigate emerging housing policy. Yeah, we probably didn't dwell on that too much, other than to say
It's a problem.
It's a problem, and maybe hire a planner when you're unsure.
Right. At least one person said how to make a lot of money. And probably the answer is stay away.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a bit of a passion project, or this one was. I think the next one would be easier. We've learned a lot.
Yeah.
And 23% said how to make an urban impact. So, well, that's good. I think,
I think A, B, and D are what we're most proud of, I think. And hopefully C will turn out better next time.
Right. So. We're working on the next project. P&R Developments just bought a property a month ago, not even. Just
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, but we started working on it a month ago, developing alternatives. And so it will be a sixplex.
Plus a laneway house, yeah.
Plus a laneway house, also in the downtown, and not too far from this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So, questions?
Right.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Cheryl and Rolf, for that excellent presentation. As you mentioned, we're going to shift into the Q&A portion of the webinar now, and I already see there are quite a few questions in the Q&A box. But if you haven't yet, and if you have a question for our speakers, please do type those in the Q&A window. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. But we'll go ahead and get started with some of the questions we have here. So our first question relates to the railing system. So looking at your railing system on the exterior stairs, the code says a 1-inch level extension is required at top and bottom for grasping. How did you circumvent that?
We just didn't do it. And nobody made us do it, I guess. The building, I wasn't there when the building inspector was doing an inspection on those things.
It never came up, actually. I mean, it's hard to see in the photos, but there is a reveal under the railings. So I don't know if it's 1 inch or what the size is exactly.
Well, they're talking about the extension, but those extensions often become problematic in that they catch your hip as you're turning around them, you know.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. I think that's what the question is asking about. So we actually tried to minimize those just in terms of, comfort and moving around, because everything is relatively close.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Someone has asked here, what is the city's position regarding increase to water and sanitary servicing?
That's an interesting subject. So they subsequent to this project. So there's you can request with you know, you need engineering support when you're designing the scale of project. So the engineer will give you a design that and for the water service and the sewer service. So when they are in a house stream, so that's not in site plan control, they expect you to deal with stormwater on site and grade the site so that it flows off the site cleanly and neatly. And then typically wastewater service, you can stay within the sort of the standard, like a 6-inch service, which you would normally have for a house or a duplex. So most projects would be that. And then up to 5 units, you can stay within. There's a standard where you basically just put in a request and they come and do you at a set price. Then if you go above that, you have to go to an ICI model, so where you have your engineer provide a plan and propose it, and they bid it to contractors, and then you have to pay them in advance, and then they come and do it. And so that's significantly more expensive. So typically you want to try and avoid that, but they don't have, for instance, 2-inch water service would be pretty handy for up to 15 units, or I forget what the number is. But you as a standard, but we're asking the city if they would consider it, but they probably won't. So they're easygoing, let's say, but there's a process depending on where you fall.
Okay, great. Thank you. A bit of a longer question here. So it begins, your Gerrard Street project is wonderfully resolved. Question is, how would you modify this prototype, if at all, in a more typical mid-block laneway condition, in brackets, not the end/corner condition, against a side of the adjacent house? Would you feel the laneway units may be more challenged if there were other laneway units or garages directly across the laneway?
We did have the benefit of having the laneway houses face the rear yard of the neighbor, so the flanking backyard of the neighbor. Yeah, it might have been different, perhaps, in terms of having them so open to the laneway. I think it depends on the neighborhood and the character of the neighborhood. I mean, there's more and more laneway houses emerging all the time. And many laneways are pretty lively, nice places. And I don't think that it's necessarily a problem to have a front door and a window on the lane, but many of them that I'm seeing around Trinity Bellwoods and the Annex tend to minimize the windows on the lane at ground level and sort of focus on upper level windows. So I guess it's got to do with the level of use of the lane by different people and types of people.
Yeah, I think one of the things that would change quite a bit is if the lot you're using is on a corner. So then you have if you have a side yard condition, then you'd start to think about the entrances to the lane house and to the multiplex differently. If you have
yeah, certainly. I mean, I would use a side yard entrance if I had a corner for sure.
Yeah,
but we didn't in this case, and therefore put them on the front and the back.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So you might have already talked about this a little bit in terms of Rolf bribing people with cake, but someone has asked about NIMBYism, if you experienced this and how was that managed? I don't know if the cake was part of that.
Well, it was a big. I mean, when we went for severance, we really did not expect to be turned down, because technically there was no reason, and we we had 2 public meetings in advance of the committee trying to get the neighbors on side. And, you know, we're pretty, tried to be as friendly as we could. And we're surprised that they all came out against. So NIMBYism is I think I'm scarred, and I don't want to do it again, put it that way.
That is go to committee of adjustment again.
Let's go to committee of adjustment. But I'm told that it's easier now. The province made appeals a lot harder. So for neighbors. But it's still, if you have to appeal, it takes forever, and it's expensive. So
most of the pushback was against the lack of parking. Right? We have no parking space except for that one little electric car, which
half-size car.
Yeah. So everybody was very concerned about parking spaces. But I gotta say, whenever I'm in that neighborhood, I would always be able to park on the adjacent north-south street on Norwood, no issue, and on the street until 4 o'clock. So it was, in certain neighborhoods, parking really is an issue, but there's also good transit in denser neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And we have excellent transit here. So the parking issue really was mute, but it meant a lot to the neighbors.
And you know, and I think people are just against apartments. I don't know why.
Yeah, since 1912.
Right. Yeah.
They don't like,
Right.
They don't like singles and small families.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so our next question, someone has asked, I'm interested in your shared entrance porch within our contemporary culture / society, one focused on privacy. Did you consider a Hertzberger-inspired shared space at the entry for neighbors if the concept, particularly at the back, excuse me, revolved around shared common space?
Okay. The front entrance porch is actually quite generous. You can see it in this image if you've got a bigger monitor. I think from what's great is Rolf's been able to live there in the first year and sort of feel how people feel about one another and how well they get along, and do they talk to each other. And it sounds like they're all pretty friendly.
Yeah, with exceptions, but yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure what specific Herman Hertzberger shared common space they would be talking about, but we worked with the available space, which isn't a lot, but that front porch is really just about as wide as an exterior wall, and the partition and 2 front doors, and then the perpendicular door opens off of that. But you know, you bump into people when you're going to the front porch, and you chit chat, and I think they tend to know each other.
Yeah. I think also one of the constraints was that we didn't want to do any like, once you have shared space, you might be forced into other entrances. So we had to have a single entrance to the street, to open space by the OBC. Otherwise, we were forced to start doubling up entrances or have
you mean a second mean to meet some grass.
Yeah, that's the proper term. But essentially, it would have eaten up our square footage in a hurry. And it's one of the issues with dealing with this kind of housing. And there's a movement afoot to do single stair entries. But again, that all comes with costs, and both as you know, as a landlord, but also in terms of interior space. So it's for this project for sure. We had to have individual staircases, and I think we made the best of that. In future, there may be single stairs may be an option, but right now not. And our common entrances.
Yeah, I think if that's what the question is, whether there would be a common entrance, more like you would have a common lobby space and a common stair to a series of apartments. That's really an apartment. And that's when you can't do that in the current bylaw. It's single stair egress. It's been investigated by a bunch of people, including initiated by Conrad Speckert, who did his thesis on it. It's been adopted for apartment buildings with some constraints in Vancouver and BC, and it probably will be adopted here in a few years, but that's for apartment buildings, not multiplexes.
Yeah.
Okay,
If that
great.
answers that question. Yeah.
Yeah, and we actually had Conrad Specker do a webinar not too long ago for us at the OAA.
Yeah.
So if you're interested, that one might be up on YouTube already. If not, it will be soon.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So someone has asked here, curious to return to carbon sequestration or reduction comparisons between conventional multi-housing and this project.
Oh, I don't think we ever compared project to project. It was all, for us, it was always material to material. And there wasn't that much controversy between us because everyone seemed to agree that, wood frame construction is the most sustainable that we could reasonably use. We had long debates about which kind of insulation was more sustainable, because especially on the outside, and I think Cheryl and I disagree. I prefer styrofoam over rock sole, and I think many would rather use rock anyway, but that's a subject for another time.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot less concrete.
Yeah.
The concrete's has really high embodied energy, and stick built has so many advantages, not just in terms of sequestered carbon, but it's cheaper to build. It makes space for insulation that you don't get with concrete, and it's fast to do. And when space is tight, to have that space within your building for services, etc., is quite important. Yeah, so we never did a comparison between a normal multiplex, but I don't think very many people would build out of concrete this scale of building anyway.
Right, unless you're in Germany, which that's what they do.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So someone has said here, a lot of amazing problem solving in this project with a dizzying array of regulations to deal with. Looks like a really successful project and a great model for others to work from. Can you speak a bit more about noise control between units? And did you do any post-construction testing?
I mean, we focused on it, and that was one of the reasons that we used blown cellulose, because our perception was that it would be more effective, and then I can say we have not measured with instruments and numbers, but I can say that typically inside the units, you never hear music, media, or speech from another unit. You hear the odd thump. And one specific problem that we did have, so we have these front load washing machines. They spin at a pretty high speed, and so they caused a fair bit of vibration. And so I had to go and get vibration isolating pads for all of the machines, and those kinds of noises do transfer. And so for the next one, we're toying with a slight change. I think we'll do like a gypsum topping on all the floors, but again, we'll probably still have the same problem with the washing machines.
It was noticeable, the difference once the insulation went in during construction. Suddenly you couldn't hear anything. You couldn't hear the streetcars going by. It's quite effective. The walls are all 300 millimeters plus thick, depending on the outside. Yeah, depending on where they are. The exterior walls, and the roof is 400 plus.
So we designed for it, but we haven't measured the result. We just have the sort of day-to-day experience.
Right. Okay, great. Two questions regarding the party wall boundary. One person has just said, could you please go through the party wall boundary board one more time? And then another has asked, in that party wall assembly, were those symbols indicating wood studs, or is the C channel frame structural? And what is the thickness? And they've said that's a nice alternative to concrete block.
Yeah, so the party wall is essentially there are two 2x4 stud walls, and in between them are two layers of liner board, which is gypsum, 1 inch, 25 millimeter gypsum. So there's 50 millimeters of gypsum in steel U channels, and so starting from the outside, we have a layer of drywall. Then we have the 2x4 studs insulated with cellulose. We used vapor barrier because we wanted an air barrier. And then the two layers of gypsum.
Type-X.
Yeah, it's Type-X, but it's commonly used for like
shaft walls and
things like that. And then the same on the other side. And then in order to satisfy the OBC, that because this is a firewall in their definition, that means it has to be standing after one of the buildings in fact falls down. So there's a system of clips where you basically that are clipped to the U channel supporting the drywall, and they're aluminum, so they're burned off if the one structure leaves, and so it leaves the gypsum attached to the one that's not burnt is the concept. So and this system is available from all the major gypsum manufacturers. You just have to find it. So I can tell you that the rough trade was happy to be doing this rather than having to wait for masons or concrete.
Okay, great. Just a quick note, we have 8 minutes left, but we can go slightly over our time as long as our presenters are okay with sticking around a few minutes because there are still quite a few questions left. Okay, perfect. Okay. So we have a question here. So someone has said, given the scale of development required to make a material change to the density of the city or a given neighborhood, and the fact that it took a year to find a site, in brackets, if I heard this correctly, can you please walk us through the challenges experienced in finding the site and how this process might be expedited?
Okay, well, I mean, it depends. I mean, of course, it depends. You know, we've been getting experience with a certain kind of tenant. So now I know I kind of have a feel. We have a feel for what they can afford, right, and what kind of neighborhoods they like. So then you have to find this site, and the biggest problem is finding a wide site because multiplexes like lots of room side to side. And so if you can find a wide site, now the city has made it a lot easier because they have these blanket basic envelopes. They've said that gross floor area is not important for multiplexes anymore. You have a height limit, a depth limit, and setback limits, and mansard roofs, as Cheryl is fond of pointing out. And if you can live with it with those parameters, in fact, you can build a pretty generous building. So this last site, I think we've been looking for about 4 months solid. And I do a fair bit of work before we'll put an offer in. So we usually, and so it means you understand your budget before you make a proposal to buy, and then it's just a matter of if you have the money and you can agree. So I'm hoping with the next one, with this one coming up, we're hoping that we will not need committee of adjustment, and so that we can, in fact, if we closed it, I think June 1st, so that's less than 2 weeks ago. So I'm hoping we can be in construction by the fall, so which would be lightning fast, and then we can use all the things we learned in Girard here. So.
I don't have the data handy, but I have read that the uptake in applications, permit applications for this kind of housing has dramatically increased in the last 2 years. So there are people finding sites. But yeah, I don't know what the advice, like you've provided some advice. There's no magic thing because sites are all different. But I guess knowing a neighborhood or the character of a neighborhood and what it offers in terms of wide sites.
I can say that the site that we just purchased, it was a bidding war between 4 builders.
We're all trying to do the same.
Yeah,
it's a 40-foot wide.
I know that we have. Yeah, we got it because we were willing to pay the most. That's all. People are picking this up now.
So this new site is 40 feet wide, and we're doing a 6-plex on that, and it has a nice relationship backing onto a lane and a green space behind the lane that belongs to another housing project. So
it's pretty nice, yeah.
But yeah, I guess it's, maybe you have a team of people if you're a developer that are the hunters for property.
Yeah. And there's some areas that are easier than others. We're finding it a lot easier to work in the East End. I have friends that say, why aren't you doing anything in the West End? Well, it's been picked over. So
we explored a site this winter on Lakeshore Boulevard near Etobicoke, or in Etobicoke, I guess. Yeah. And a very different area. It's hard to know, and also if you don't know the area, it's hard to know if there would be uptake. Very different levels of, I think, acceptance of higher density, although it's happening there too. There's lots of big lots there.
Yeah. And we'll see. The landscape is changing all the time. So
great. Okay. I think we can take a few more questions. So someone has said here, great project, nice human scale. And then they ask, was it the balconies in combination with a dedicated stair, i.e. versus a shared exit stair, that allowed the project to meet the code requirement for 2 separate exits for projects greater than 2 stories in height?
Yeah. Yes. We don't need 2 separate exits.
No, we don't, but that's because we have the balcony and the dedicated stair. And the balcony is also an amenity, so it's for us, it's a win. And this site it's pretty. The building's only 14 meters deep, so it's a miracle we got so many 3 bedrooms into it.
We did have a second means of egress designed at one point off the balconies, which was horrible. It took up a huge amount of space and ugly, and we were very pleased to be able to get rid of that.
Right.
Okay, great. Okay, so someone here said, they said, thank you for your very valuable session. We are working on a few of these now, and it's great to see others going through the same hoops. Really appreciate the architect/developer perspective as well. So many of the issues you raised are what we are seeing as well, especially when dealing with AHJ. Projects like this almost always result in COA for us. Looking back, would you have gone to COA for more GFA or some other improvements to the building?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it would have been nice to, what we always worked within.
Yeah. I mean, initially, as you could hear, I was kind of ticked off about the mansard requirement because it seemed to constrain space significantly. But then when you build the units, it's not actually that bad. You've got headroom within a lot of that space anyway. And depending on how you detail the mansard, it's not so bad. So no, there's nothing I think that in retrospect would have been worth going to C of A about.
Yeah,
On
although
that one, maybe another one
we got denied anyway, so I mean we may as well have had 2 denials, but others may have been harder to appeal than the severance was.
One of the things that we're experiencing on this new project that I've been designing, is the width of, so we're using bay windows, and some of the rules around bay windows that didn't seem to exist before, but are emerging from the response we're getting from the preliminary review, are that we need to have at least 50% of that bay be window for it to be called a bay window. So you can't just build boxes, hang 750 millimeter deep boxes off your building to expand the scale of an interior space and put a single bedroom window in it. They don't want to see that. So I think people are starting, and yet we didn't do that on Gerrard Street.
Right.
So people are, I guess, looking for every possible way to manipulate some of these rules already. Right. And the city's looking out for that. I don't know if that's actually policy, because you don't find it written anywhere. It's just a response we get.
Well, it's policy. It's just policy. Yeah. You don't get to hear about until they turn you down. So yeah.
So some of that stuff, I think it might be worth, because it impacts the look of the building significantly, and the amount of window, like you're ending up putting windows where you don't want windows. In the end, I think it's just treading on design and architects' mandates or
I think it's
purview.
I think it's fair to say that the city is much too invasive on design. Then one of the things they are doing that I like is that with multiplex, that they're saying, okay, the limits are how high and how wide and how deep you can go, and then that's it. That I think it makes it much simpler. That okay, you have to meet OBC, which is its own separate different argument about single stair, for instance, but that they have the mansards in particular, or bay windows or what have you. It just means you have they're trying to legislate looks, and it really means that if you aren't willing to spend the time like Cheryl is, you're going to end up with a lot of ugly buildings.
Yeah. So on this view, on the second floor below that cantilevered balcony, that's a bedroom window in a bay. And you don't really need you don't need 50% of that bay to be window for that kind of use, but that's what they're asking for now.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a battle all the time, right? Just to kind of get something that's nice and
makes sense
and makes
in
sense
other ways.
Right. So, but you either do it in your starting out, or you do it at committee and argue with the neighbors. So it's a choice.
Right. Okay, perfect. So maybe one more question. So actually, well, there's 2 questions that related to the occupants. So one asked how renters were selected, and then another asked, did you find the tenants before looking for the site, or I guess afterwards?
No. So our tenants, actually, it was a learning experience, particularly for me. And so I have the summary I make is that our tenants tend to be families in transition. So for instance, we've had 3 tenants, one that's come and gone, that are families that are renovating houses elsewhere. And so that's kind of interesting. then we have, like, I have a family, those one woman, her husband died. And so she's living there with her 2 kids. I have a couple of single parents with, well, no, more than a couple. 1, 2, 3, 4 that are single parents with their kids at home, either full-time or in a couple of cases part-time. And then another family, they've just never chosen to buy a house. And they're, you know, they have teenage kids, and I think, well, I mean, one's in university and one's still in high school, and you know, so they're actually, their next transition may be into something smaller. But I've learned that there's a pretty, and we do have a couple of tenants that are, you know, just young couples with no kids. But there's a tremendous need for the family size. We find that it's easier to rent the larger than the smaller, which was a surprise to me.
Yeah, Rolf wants to do all 3 bedrooms on the new project, not a mix of 2 and 3.
Yeah, yeah. That may be also part of the, you know, the current, you know,
work from home thing.
Yeah, well, work from home, but also there's a lot of condos. There's more studio units than you could hope to fill, and 1 bedrooms and to a lesser extent 2 bedrooms, but yeah, but.
Great. Okay. And I guess let's take one final question. So, someone has asked here, what are your lessons learned on most impactful measures for making future projects of this type more financially successful?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing I mean, there's a couple of things. One, that Gabion system with the you know, with the planting, I'm going to keep. I think it's terrific. Makes the lower unit like you know, real. It's no longer a basement apartment. That makes a big difference. Stick built is we tried really hard to do panel building.
Yeah.
And it wasn't viable. It cost more. And in this site particularly, you can see on the picture, there's the overhead wires. There's nowhere to put a crane. And you have to remember that it's something that's built modularly. It all has to be transported to site. So it's got to fit under bridges. It's got to fit on trucks, and then it's got to be lifted by crane. And you've got to be able to do it on site. So, and you know, the Gerard has a streetcar. There's no possibility we would be able to afford a big enough crane, or like a situation where we could block the streetcar line for a day while we craned in, or multiple days, because you can't usually do it in a day, right? It just, the whole thing wasn't viable.
Well, another thing that, I mean, you've talked about before, we discussed mass timber construction early on as a, you know, would that be more efficient in terms of time and in erecting the structure? And that was for similar reasons: access to the site, erection,
and the sheer cost.
And the sheer cost of it. And what was the other reason was, I guess sheer cost was the main thing. Sheer cost was but we investigated it. It just was, well, you're also thickness, right? You're losing access to, you're having to add another layer for cavities, for power and everything else, plumbing and everything else. So yeah, it really stick built was the most efficient way to go. And as you were pointing out, it's a really, the structure, the framing is one of the smaller components of the overall construction cost. It goes up quite fast anyway with a team of builders.
Yeah. Out of the $275 a square foot, I think it was 30 of that is the structure.
So,
The stick building.
yeah,
So yeah, it's really hard to imagine anything, you know. And in the past, I helped on a straw bale house. You think, oh, that's cheap? No, not cheap.
yeah.
You just try put your electrical into a straw bale, right?
Well,
Or put baseboards on the, yeah.
well, we did that at the Zero House project that we worked on, but we had 16-inch thick walls plus a whole chase inside of that.
Yeah, yeah. It's just,
it was more than 16 inch. The bales themselves
Yeah.
were 16 inches. So in an urban site, it's not really viable. The land's too valuable for walls that thick. Yeah.
it's just, that's a whole rabbit hole you can go into.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, I guess lessons learned are keep doing what we were doing.
Yeah,
Probably in
yeah,
terms
yeah.
of
And it's
construction.
easy to get the trades, so
Yeah.
that's important. You need people to do it too.
Mm. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I think that's all the questions we'll take. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions. I apologize if we missed yours, but Cheryl and Rolf's emails have been placed in the chat. So if you would like to get in touch with them afterwards, if you still have some more questions, please feel free to do so. And I'll just leave off with a few closing announcements. First, I want to extend a huge thank you to Cheryl and Rolf for this excellent presentation. I know our members learned a lot. Again, so we had great engagement through the Q&A and through the polls as well. So that was great to see. So thanks so much for this presentation. And again, few announcements. So for those who are seeking continuing education hours, a reminder that the OAA will record your participation in this webinar on your OAA transcript. So there's no need for individual reporting on your part. We just kindly ask for your patience at this busy time of year as we process and confirm the accreditation of your hours within the next 4 business days. Attendees are going to soon receive a link to a survey to submit feedback for our presenters. So if you do get a chance to complete the survey, once you've received the link, we and our presenters highly value that feedback. So please do fill it out if you get a chance. And then finally, again, a last reminder that the 2024-2026 continuing education cycle is coming to a close on June 30th at midnight or 11:59 p.m. And we have just one webinar left before then. So that webinar takes place next Thursday, June 18th, with the title Innovation in Action at Fanshawe College. And this is a climate action webinar. So if you haven't already completed your mandatory 2 climate action hours, please be sure to check that one out. And if you are looking for additional ways to get your Con Ed hours before the end of cycle, be sure to also check out the Con Ed opportunities page on the OAA website, where we list continuing education opportunities offered by other organizations beyond the OAA. So with that, I will thank Cheryl and Rolf once again for being with us today. Thank you to all of our attendees for your engagement and participation. And I wish you all a pleasant remainder of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shalika.
Thank you.